The mockery of the monster, September 21st, 1943. The Mitsubishi Heavy Industries plant outside Nagoya, Japan. The humid air, thick with the scent of oil and pulverized aluminum, vibrates with the rhythmic clang of hammers. Colonel Kenjiro Kimura, a senior engineer with the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, wipes sweat from his brow, his eyes fixed on a detailed American reconnaissance photograph. It's a blurry but unmistakable image of a colossal bomber prototype on a runway in Wichita, Kansas. Around a long wooden table, a dozen of Japan's most brilliant aerospace minds, all men who have tasted victory at Pearl Harbor and in the skies over the Pacific, are openly The Americans have always been masters of overstatement. Kimura's superior, General Tetsuo Kurabayashi, dismisses with a wave of his hand, flicking ash from his cigarette onto the floor. They call this monstrous thing the B-29 Superfortress. A junior officer, Lieutenant Akihiro Sato, straightens his glasses. General, our agents estimate its range will exceed 5,000 kilometers. Its pressurized cabin will allow it to fly routinely above 10,000 meters higher than any of our existing interceptors can effectively operate. Kurabayashi scoffs. A sound like gravel grinding. A magnificent claim, Lieutenant. To reach Tokyo from China, it would need a wingspan longer than a bridge, carry more fuel than a destroyer, and be protected by a gun emplacement on every corner. It is an administrative fantasy, a project that will bankrupt their factories long before it reaches our skies. The room laughs again, a sound of absolute, secure confidence. They knew the tyranny of distance was their greatest ally. America's strategic bombing force, the famed B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, had to launch from island bases like Guadalcanal or New Guinea, placing them hundreds, often thousands, of miles away from the Japanese homeland. Their reach was limited. Their bombs were small, and their presence was a distant rumor, not a clear and present danger to the Emperor's cities. Kimura, however, found no humor in the image. He knew the relentless, almost terrifying focus of American industry. He saw not a fantasy, but a cold, calculating threat. "Genra," Kimura interjected, his voice quiet but firm. "The photograph is real. They are building it. The technical specifications, however improbable, demand a response. If they succeed, the war will be brought to our living rooms." Kurabayashi fixed Kimura with a dismissive glare. "Then let us focus on building faster Zero fighters and more powerful torpedoes, Colonel. Not on the Americans' pipe dreams." B-29 Superfortress is operational. Their bases in China will be overrun, and their carriers will be at the bottom of the Pacific. The meeting ended with a consensus of arrogant certainty. The B-29 was an over-engineered boondoggle, an artifact of American hubris, destined to fail. Japan was safe, protected by the vast ocean and the limited range of existing Allied bombers. The commanders mocked the B-29, an abstract threat on a fuzzy photograph, and turned their focus back to the immediate, manageable battles in the Pacific. They had failed to appreciate that the Superfortress was not designed for the island-hopping campaigns. It was designed for them, and for the destruction of their heartland. The first rumblings of a distant, horrifying new reality had begun. The silent approach, and the first sting. June 15th, 1944. A moonless, suffocatingly hot night over the Sichuan province of China. The air inside the aluminum shell of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, christened the Dauntless Dottie, was cold, pressurized, and taut with adrenaline. Flight engineer Sergeant Eddie Malone monitored the four massive Ryder 3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each struggling to gulp the thin, high-altitude air. They were flying at 27,000 feet, an altitude that offered protection from nearly all Japanese anti-aircraft fire and their land-based fighters. Below them lay the vast, dark expanse of the Chinese mainland, a grueling 2,000-mile journey from their staging fields near China. This was Operation Matterhorn, the first true test of the B-29's strategic reach. Their target, Yawata, a crucial steelworks complex on the island of Kyushu, Japan. Major Alva, Stormy Harris, the aircraft commander, squinted through his windscreen. "Navigator, confirmation on the projected time over target," he radioed, his voice tight. "Target area ETA 0 to 100 hours. Major," the navigator replied. his voice tinny in Harris's headset. "We're running heavy on fuel, but the winds are holding." The mission was audacious. The Americans had constructed 5 huge airfields in China, a logistical miracle that required 500,000 Chinese laborers and miles of hand-poured concrete. The plan was not to sustain continuous attacks from China, which proved too difficult to supply over the treacherous air route over the Himalayas, but to prove a terrifying point. The Japanese home islands were now within striking distance. Back in Tokyo, in a subterranean command bunker beneath the Imperial Palace, General Tetsuo Kobayashi was presiding over a late-night conference focused on the defense of the Marianas. The B-29 was still an afterthought, a nuisance relegated to intelligence reports. "The Americans are using the China fields to harass peripheral targets in Manchuria," the reports concluded. * No credible threat to the Kanto Plain. * Then, at 0:38 a.m., the radio room crackled with an urgent priority signal from Kyushu. General Yawata reports air raid sirens. Multiple incoming enemy heavy bombers. Altitude estimated above 8,000 meters. A hush fell over the room. 8,000 meters was high, but not impossible. Kobayashi dismissed it. Likely a small force of B-24s or reconnaissance craft. Isolated harassments. Dispatch the available Nakajima, Kisisisoki. Interceptors from the local command. They are not to waste fuel chasing shadows. But the shadows were massive, and they were very real. 47 B-29s, flying in an arrowhead formation, began their bomb run over Yo. The bombs, a mix of high explosive and incendiaries, slammed into the steel. The resulting explosions and fires were visible for miles. The damage was limited mostly due to operational and mechanical teething problems with a new bomber and the sheer distance of the mission, but the psychological impact was immediate and profound. At 4 a.m., the first detailed reports reached Tokyo. They spoke of a new type of bomber, far larger, faster, and flying impossibly high. The Yawata attack proved that the B-29 was not a fantasy. It was an operational weapon, capable of launching deep strikes from bases that Japan had considered safely distant. The mockery of Colonel Kimura's meeting 11 months prior had been replaced by a sickening, cold dread. Japan was no longer an inviolable fortress. The distant war had just breached the perimeter. The futile defense and the new base of terror, October 25, 1944. The skies above Omura, Airbase Kyushu, Japan. The air was frigid and thin at 30,000 feet. But the cockpit of the Japanese Army's new twin-engine interceptor, the Kawasaki Ki-45 Toya Dragon Killer, was focused on heat. Lieutenant Yoshio Morita gripped the controls, his breath fogging the internal glass. He was leading a Tokubetsu Kajiketai, a special attack unit tasked with the impossible, intercepting the American giants. His aircraft was stripped of armor for speed and armed with a daunting but difficult weapon, a forward-firing 37mm cannon, capable of puncturing the B-29's hull, but requiring devastatingly close range to be effective. Altitude report. Morita-san. His radio crackled. The ground controller sounded strained. "I am at 9,500 meters. Chase-in," Morita replied, straining to see through the glare. "They are higher. They are above 10,000. Too fast." The B-29, flying in the extreme upper layers of the troposphere, was operating at an altitude where Japanese piston-engine fighters like the Zira and even the higher-climbing Ki-44 lost critical engine performance. The air was too thin for their superchargers to maintain full power, making them sluggish, difficult to control, and critically, too slow to catch the cruising It was a brutal game of chasing ghosts. The Americans, too, were learning. The missions from China's Chengdu bases were proving too costly in fuel and logistical effort. The long-range flights often meant insufficient fuel for evasive action over the target, and the need to ferry gasoline over the hump. The treacherous air route over the Himalayas was unsustainable. But this reality was about to be obliterated by a new strategic development, far to the south. On November 24, 1944, Japanese defense radar operators on Hachio, Jima Island, picked up a massive, unprecedented wave of aircraft. This was not the sporadic harassment from China. This was the start of the sustained, systematic destruction of the Japanese industrial complex. Over 100 B-29s, flying in tight formation, appeared, their silver fuselages catching the morning sun. Their origin was no longer China, but the newly captured and rapidly constructed bases on the Mariana Islands, specifically Saipan and Tinian. This new launch point was a catastrophic strategic blow. The distance to Tokyo from the Marianas was only 1,500 miles, half the distance of the Chengdu flights. The supply chain was direct from the Pacific, not over the Himalayas, and the bases were capable of holding hundreds of aircraft. The Japanese High Command stared at the map in stunned silence. The mocking certainty of 1943 had metastasized into absolute terror. The Superfortress was now a direct, overwhelming force, and it was coming straight for the imperial capital. That day, the first wave of B-29s launched from the Marianas, commanded by Brigadier General Haywood S. Hansel, Jr., struck the Musashino Aircraft Works in Tokyo, the very factories attempting to build the interceptors meant to stop them. The homeland was officially under siege. Colonel Kenjiro Kimura's worst fears had materialized, not as a sporadic nuisance, but as a relentless, 1,000-ton bomber-fueled reality. The jet illusion and the high-altitude stalemate. December 3rd, 1944. The wind-battered fuselage of a B-29, designated city of San Francisco, returning to Saipan from its fourth mission over Japan. Inside the rear blister turret, Staff Sergeant Gus Peterson watched the blue-black emptiness of the Pacific rush past. He felt the cold, hard logic of their success. Altitude was life. The Japanese defenses were improving, but they were still struggling to breach the B-29's operational ceiling of 30,000 feet. The Japanese were desperate, resorting to increasingly radical, nearly suicidal interception tactics. Peterson had seen them single-engine fighters attempting to ram the Superfortress in midair, pilots sacrificing themselves for a chance to bring down the behemoth. The Japanese High Command, realizing the futility of conventional propeller fighters, pinned their hopes on a technological leap: jet propulsion. At the Kawanishi and Nakajima plants, crash programs were underway to produce the Nakajima Kika, similar to the German Mi-262, and the rocket-powered Mitsubishi Hota-8 Emisushi, based on the Mi-163 Comet. General Tetsuo Kurabayashi, now stripped of his earlier arrogance and haunted by the increasing sound of air raid sirens in Tokyo, addressed his surviving air commanders. "We must hold them off until the jets are ready. These B-29s are vulnerable only during their final bomb run, when they must descend slightly for accurate targeting. That is our window." The Japanese strategy became one of brutal attrition. The Ki-45 Toryu and the newly deployed single-engine Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate Frank, fighters equipped with higher compression engines and a willingness to fly beyond safe operational limits were tasked with intercepting the formations. The battles were brief and violent. A few B-29 Segundos were shut down, but the Superfortress's coordinated defensive fire employing the revolutionary General Electric Central Fire Control System, which allowed a gunner to remotely control multiple turrets, proved devastating to the Japanese attackers. In late December, a new, more horrifying problem emerged for the B-29 crews: the jet stream. Flying at 30,000 feet, the formations encountered winds of up to 200 knots, causing the bombers to drift violently off course, scattering their bomb loads miles away from the intended target, and drastically increasing fuel consumption. The high-altitude precision bombing strategy, championed by General Hansel, was failing to achieve the desired destructive results. Japan's industrial capacity, though dented, remained largely intact. The stalemate had been reached. The B-29 was too high to be reliably intercepted, but the wind was too strong for the B-29 to bomb effectively. The strategic bombing campaign, which had promised to win the war quickly, was grinding to an agonizing, expensive halt. The Americans needed a radical change in tactics to shatter the Japanese morale and industrial base. The Japanese, fighting for time until their jet fighters could emerge, believed they had found a temporary, if brutal, reprieve. The architect of annihilation and the deadly descent. March 9th, 1945. Guam, Mariana Islands. The atmosphere in the massive briefing hangar was dense with cigarette smoke and skepticism. Brigadier General Curtis LeMay, a man known for his bluntness and an iron disregard for conventional tactics, stood before the assembled B-29 group commanders. LeMay had replaced the meticulous, high-altitude theorist General Hunsel, and his mandate was simple: burn Japan to the ground. Gentlemen, LeMay began, his voice flat and uncompromising. The precision bombing strategy is a bust. We are fighting the jet stream and we are wasting effort bombing empty factories. We are going to change the rules, effective immediately. We are flying low, we are flying slow, and we are flying with only one type of payload. The commanders exchanged uneasy glances. Low altitude meant flying directly into the heaviest concentrations of Japanese anti-aircraft guns and the operational ceiling of the Japanese interceptors. It was suicidal by conventional standards. LeMay slammed his hand on the table, silencing the murmurs. We are stripping every bomber down. No side guns, no rear turrets, except for the tail gunner. No heavy defensive ammunition. We are taking out the armor plating and the heavy gear, all of it. We are trading the weight for more fuel and M69 incendiary clusters. The new plan was breathtaking in its audacity and terrifying in its potential cost. The B-29s, designed to fly above the defenses at over 30,000 feet, would now descend to altitudes between 5,000 and 8,000 feet. They would fly at night, relying on stealth and the element of surprise, delivering a concentrated rain of napalm gel incendiary bombs onto the densely packed wooden and paper structures of Tokyo. The first mission, Operation Meeting, was set for the night of March 9th, 10th. The primary target, the densely populated, working-class Shidamachi district of eastern Tokyo. Back in Tokyo, Colonel Kenjiro Kimura was now an aide to the Defense Command, a man whose earlier warnings had become grim prophecy. He was coordinating the deployment of the few radar-equipped Ki-45s to counter the expected high-altitude formations. The city's civil defense was prepared for high-explosive bombs, but not for a citywide firestorm. As the first B-29 Pathfinders appeared, flying silently and low, the Japanese anti-aircraft crews were confused. Why so low? Where are the formations? The radar operators struggled to track the stripped, lighter aircraft. The air raid warnings came too late. At 0:07 a.m., March 10th, the first sticks of M69s hit the Kanda district. The liquid fire, igniting instantly, spread with terrifying speed, fueled by 40-mile-per-hour winds blowing across the low-lying urban sprawl. The B-29s, no longer mocking fantasy but low-flying harbingers of apocalypse, appeared directly above the capital. Tokyo was not just being bombed, it was being consumed. The firestorm and the reality of defeat, March 10th, 1945. The inferno of Tokyo, Japan. The city was a churning, white-hot mess. The 334 stripped-down B-29s had dropped nearly 1,700 tons of incendiary bombs in a 3-hour run. The fires, coalescing into a single, massive firestorm, consumed oxygen so rapidly that people were asphyxiated in concrete shelters. The winds reached gale force, whipping the flames into towering columns that incinerated everything in their path. The temperature on the ground was estimated to have reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. General Tetsuo Kurabayashi stood on a rooftop bunker near the Imperial Palace, the heat of the conflagration searing his face despite the distance. His air defense strategy was irrelevant. His interceptors were grounded. Trying to fly through the intense heat and updrafts of the firestorm would have been suicidal. Even the anti-aircraft guns, scattered and overwhelmed, could not track the low-flying, fast-moving silver shapes silhouetted against the colossal blaze. They fly through their own smoke. A frantic junior officer screamed over the roar of the fire. They are not even using searchlights. They see the entire city. The human toll was immediate and staggering. An estimated 100,000 people more than the immediate casualties of the later nuclear bombing of Nagasaki perished in that single night. 16 square miles of the city were obliterated. The wooden homes, small factories, and tightly packed workshops that supported Japan's war economy were gone. Colonel Kenjiro Kimura, now attempting to coordinate rescue efforts in the eastern districts, saw the charred, unrecognizable streets, a landscape transformed into a Dantean vision of hell. He finally understood the full, terrible scale of American industrial power, and the ruthlessness of General LeMay's tactics. The mockery of the B-29 as an over-engineered fantasy was paid for in ash and blood. It was no longer a question of if the Americans could strike the homeland. It was a question of how long the homeland could endure the strikes. The firebombing campaign continued relentlessly across Japan's 6 largest cities in the following weeks, devastating Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and Yokohama. The strategic purpose was no longer just the destruction of industry, but the complete collapse of civilian will and the Japanese infrastructure. The B-29, once dismissed as a paper tiger, had proven itself the most fearsome weapon of the strategic air war. It had effectively shrunk the Pacific, turning the vast distance into a mere runway for the delivery of annihilation, making the inviolable homeland a charred ruin, and confirming to the Imperial Command that their war was irrevocably lost.